Man, I really like that song. Last week we sung that after the sermon, and it was on my mind all week. This morning, and Curtis shows up a little bit later, and I hear Curtis walking down the hall singing the same song that I've been singing all week. And I think that's the power of Christian hymns, that they stick with you. They teach a message that you need to hear. They uplift us. They unite us. They teach us. They encourage us. God had it planned out well when and we see the early church singing together. There's benefits to it, and I know it helps me get through difficult times, as I'm sure it does you too. What we want to look at this morning, and I want to go right into our topic. We've been in the book of Acts, and as we look at the book of Acts, you remember that we're talking about how the early Christians turned the world upside down. How Christianity as a movement, starting there in Jerusalem after the resurrection of Jesus, spread, from Judea, Samaria to the othermost parts of the world. And even today, we are here because of those early Christians and how they spread that Jesus movement, how they spread the message of the gospel. But as we've seen, as we go through the book of Acts, there's some specific challenges that the early church would have faced. And I want to kind of remind us of some of those challenges that we've already looked at before we get into our text today. As you think about the Christians in the first century, first and foremost, we always think of persecution. We think about the fact that when they came together, it oftentimes was under the threat of persecution from the government, from people, from the Jews, through many different people who wanted to stop them from following Jesus. That made it difficult. On top of that, in the early church, you have some changes that take place in different individuals' lives. You have some conversions that bring some challenges with them. A couple weeks ago, remember, we talked about Saul and the wake-up call that Saul received and how he was converted to Jesus, how he was baptized, and how his sins were washed away, and how he became a Christian. And we kind of glossed over it a little bit, but if you remember, in Acts chapter 9, in verse 20, that after Saul is converted, he goes into the synagogues, and that's where the Christians met too, by the way. We always think, he's going there to preach to the Jews and try to convert them. It's not just that. The early church used the synagogues, which was like ancient church buildings, as a place to come together and assemble and study and teach about Jesus. So Saul shows up there where all the Christians are. And the first thing the Christians think is, isn't he the man, the one who wreaked havoc in Jerusalem among all those who call on his name? And hasn't he come here to take them as prisoners to the chief priest? So think about this. Saul, before he became a Christian, was had his hand in the murder of Stephen. He would have men and women arrested for their faith and cast into prison. He was an evil guy who terrorized the church. And yet now he shows up to worship. He shows up to the assembly and says, I'm preaching Jesus now. Do you think that was just an easy transition for the people? You mean, these are Christians that when they saw him would hide. They'd hide their families. They were afraid for their lives. And all of a sudden, this guy shows up, and they're supposed to study with him. They're supposed to worship with him. They're supposed to greet him with a holy kiss, as Romans 16:16 says, right? Do you think they would have wanted to do that? You think there would have been a strain on that relationship? What if they would have just written him off? What if they would have just said, no, we're not going to deal with this guy? What if they would have said, this is just too much. He's wreaked too much havoc. I don't buy it. Their damage has been done. We're not going to move forward. The church wouldn't have been where it was and wouldn't be where it is at even today. It wouldn't have been easy for those first century Christians to welcome Saul. We always look at how great it was. They all got along. I guarantee it. There was arguments. There was doubt. There was fear. There was problems when he became a Christian. What about the fact that in the early church, too, you have Jew and Gentile coming together? You have Jerusalem, which is primarily a Jewish church. Antioch later in Acts, we see, is primarily a Gentile church. And together, Christians are coming as one and supposed to get along. The Jews didn't like the Gentiles. They were prejudiced against them. There was racism and hatred. And because of that, the Gentiles didn't trust the Jews or like them because of the racist insults and the prejudice that they had against them. And yet, Jew and Gentile were supposed to come together and be one church. I mean, we can't even get Democrats and Republicans half the time to get together in one church. And yet here you had Jews and Gentiles come together. It was a challenge. These relationships would have been hard to build up. That relationship wouldn't have been easy, but yet it was a necessity if the early church was going to turn the world upside down. With that thought in mind, and we're going to come back to this idea of building up these relationships, turn your Bibles to Acts chapter 10. And we're going to look at a situation that you're probably familiar with. I remember being a kid in Sunday school learning this story. But as we look at this account here in Acts chapter 10, I want you to keep in mind the idea of love and tolerance and building each other up and encouragement and how all relationships can be repaired. Let's read Acts chapter 10, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now there was a man in Caesarea named Cornelius, a centurion of what is called the Italian cohort, a devout man and one who feared God with all his household, and he gave many alms to the people and prayed to God continually." So here you have a man, a Gentile man, a man who works for the Roman army, a man who wasn't somebody who would have been looked favorably upon, at least by Jewish Christians, because of his background there as being a Gentile. So you have this Roman man who's called devout. He fears God, he gives, and he prays. So he's going down the path here. He knows where he wants to do. He wants to follow God, but yet, obviously there's some challenges here ahead. In verse 3 it says, "And about the 9th hour of the day, he clearly saw in a vision an angel of God who had come in and said to him, 'Cornelius.' And fixing his gaze on him and being much alarmed, he said, 'What is it, Lord?' And he said to him, 'Your prayers and alms have ascended as a memorial before God. Now dispatch some men to Joppa and send for a man named Simon who is called Peter. He is staying with a tanner named Simon whose house is by the sea.' And Cornelius sends his servants to go do that." So let's break this down. Cornelius is a man who loves God and fears him, who's seeking the truth. Cornelius is a Gentile. He's a Roman, works for the Roman government as a soldier. This Gentile soldier prays to God and asks God, apparently for something here, maybe answers, maybe deliverance, maybe salvation. So he prays to God, and God appears to him, sends him a message saying, "Send for a man by the name of Peter. He's staying at the house of Simon the tanner." So Cornelius does that. He sends his servants to go find this man named Peter. On the next day, we find out that Peter is also praying. So Cornelius was praying, and God answers the prayers of Cornelius, and now we have a situation where Peter is praying, Acts chapter 10, and here's what happens during Peter's prayer. It's a very interesting situation. Verse 9, "On the next day, as they were on their way and approaching the city, Peter went up on the housetop about the 6th hour to pray." Peter, following maybe the example of Jesus, going to a quiet place to pray, spending some time alone. We might go outside in the backyard or something. He goes up on the rooftop, which was a common in that type of architecture. That's where they'd go up and gather sometimes. So he goes up there on the housetop about the 6th hour to pray. "But he became hungry and was desiring to eat, but while they were making preparations, he fell into a trance." And I think this is some kind of divinely orchestrated, occasion that's taking place. "And he saw the sky opened up." So here's Peter's vision. The sky opens up, and there's an object like a great sheet coming down, lowered by 4 corners to the ground. So you have this like a tarp, a sheet, something lowering down from the sky. This is what Peter is seeing. And on top of this sheet is all sorts of different animals. It says 4-footed animals, crawling creatures of the earth, and birds of the air. And a voice in the middle of this vision says, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter says, "By no means, Lord, I have never eaten anything unholy and unclean." See, the animals that were on it were not the animals that a Jewish person would have normally ate. They had very strict dietary requirements from the Mosaic law forward. And now on this sheet that's being laid out before him is animals that Jewish people would not eat. And Peter says, "I can't eat that. I don't eat things that are unclean. That's impure. That's unholy." And then the voice comes to him a second time, verse 15, and says, "What God has considered holy, or what God has cleansed, no longer consider unholy." And this happened 3 times. So 3 times he sees this vision, and the voice says, "What God has cleansed, don't consider unholy." And then the object is taken up into the sky. Now when Peter was greatly perplexed in his mind as to what the vision which he had seen might be, behold, the men who had been sent by Cornelius, having asked directions for Simon's house, appeared at the gate. And in verse 19 it says, while Peter was reflecting on the vision, the Spirit said to him, behold, 3 men are looking for you. Let's break this down a little bit. Cornelius was a Gentile who was seeking God and sent his servants to go find this man named Peter, a Jewish man, to come teach him about Jesus. While that's taking place, Peter has a vision of unclean animals, but God tells him, don't consider anything that I have cleansed unclean. And all of a sudden the vision ends and there's a knock at the door, and here's these men from Cornelius. Obviously, clearly, orchestrated by God. What I want us to see from this, though, that in the background of all of this discussion of Jew and Gentile, clean and unclean, is a message that I think all of us need to hear today. It's a message that permeates, that every society needs for all times. And it's a message that love can unite the divided, and that all relationships can be repaired with love. There was a broken relationship between Jew and Gentile. There was a broken relationship back then between Saul and the early church. But those broken relationships could be repaired if the Christians approached these situations with love. Now think about what God tells Peter. He tells Peter, do not call anything unclean or impure that God has made clean. Acts chapter 10, verse 15. That's the key message that God gives Peter. Now, we could talk a lot about the fact that, that he's making all foods clean by this and all that, and that, in the New Testament system, we don't have certain foods being called unclean, and we know all of that, and that's why we don't follow the dietary restrictions of the Old Testament law. I mean, there's a change in that. But there's something more here than that. This is not just a discussion of why we can eat pork today, okay? There's more to this. The message for Peter is do not call anything impure which God has made clean. And then knock, 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 who's at the door? Servants of an unclean Gentile. Someone who he would have looked at as being impure. Someone who he would have immediately rejected normally. This man works for the Roman government. This man's a Roman soldier. In fact, the Roman soldiers are some of the same people that often maybe are part of the persecution of the early church. And yet, here are these servants from this Roman soldier at the door saying, hey, our master Cornelius has sent for you. He wants to hear from you. He could have said, impure, unclean, get out of here. But he didn't do that. Think back a couple chapters with the conversion of Saul. Don't you think the early Christians would have looked at Saul and have said, he's impure, he's unclean, this is a person who hates Christians, this is a person who puts Christians to death, this is a person who wreaks havoc on the church? They would have immediately rejected him. Think of unclean and impure as something you would reject, right? The Jews would turn up their nose. They'd have nothing to do with those unclean animals. The early church would have wanted nothing to do with Saul. He's an evil, bad guy. But yet, God cleansed him. God forgave him. God accepted him. And the understanding then is that the early church needed to accept him too. Do you think that was easy? Absolutely not. Don't you think there was probably some brethren when Saul showed up that said, we need to get him out of here. We need to protect the women and the children. What's this guy doing here? And don't you think there was conversations among the leaders, among the Christians saying, I don't trust this guy. We need to be careful. Don't you think there's people saying, I don't buy it. No, he's burned his bridges with us. They would have considered him impure and unclean. The Jewish Christians would have done the same thing for the Gentiles. Peter would have normally rejected Cornelius. But yet he's given a message by God that says, don't consider anything that I've cleansed impure and unclean. So let's think about the church then as a whole. The early church in the first century was able to unite and turn the world upside down because they worked to repair those broken relationships. They didn't just immediately reject them. See, we have this tendency to want to write everybody off. We like to write off other congregations. We like to write off preachers. We like to write off people. We like to write off people that are of different political affiliations. We like to write off people in our family. We like to write off friendships. We like to just reject people. But yet the message we see here is work to repair The relationship. What if the early church rejected Saul? What if they said, no, he can't be here? Well, we wouldn't have the book of Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, and so on. We wouldn't have those books because he wrote those. We wouldn't have the half of the message of the book of Acts that talks about the work of Saul, who's later called Paul, if they would have just rejected him. But they worked to repair those relationships. Now, we don't have a lot of what went down. We don't know all that they went through to repair that relationship with Saul. We don't know all that went down to try to get Jew and Gentiles to get together. We know that it was a challenge. You read the book of Romans, you read that it was still going on as a challenge decades later. So it takes work to repair a broken relationship. But the unifying factor in all of this was if they approached each other with love. If Saul came to the Christians and said, I love you and I want to do what's right. And if the Christians approached Saul with that same attitude and says, I love you and I want to do what's right by God, they could repair those broken relationships. So my message for us, making application to us today in the year 2020, which I know we're not dealing with Jew-Gentile relations in the church, and I know as of right now, at least, we don't have persecutors who are being converted and things like that we're dealing with firsthand. But I think an application we can all make is that all relationships, no matter what they are, no matter how strained they are, can be repaired with love. Think about it in the first century. You have persecuted Christians and their persecutor, and yet they're able to repair that relationship. The only thing that can repair that relationship is godly love. Nothing else. You can't overcome those burnt bridges. You can't fix that. That abuse, that violence, that evil mistreatment, that can only be repaired with godly love. But true godly agape love, who puts others first, is able to make it where persecuted Christians and their persecutor could get along. Jew and Gentiles, you're talking about centuries of rejection and prejudice and hatred and racism and bigotry. How could they fix that? Love. Treating people the way God would want them to treat them. Putting the needs of the other person first. Viewing individuals the way that God views them. No longer viewing them as a Gentile, but view them as a child of God. Even today, with racial tensions, even in our country right now, the way that can be overcome is we view each other the way God views each other as children of God in love. The Jews and Gentiles were able to get along because they approached it with the right attitude. They repaired the relationship with love. What about even on a practical day-to-day level in our own lives? Do we ever have family problems where we just I can't fix that. There's no moving past this situation. I truly believe that in all situations, in all family dramas, in all family problems, if all individuals approach it with the attitude of love and commitment to that relationship, it can be repaired. If a persecutor and persecuted can get along, we can fix situations in our family. The problem is sometimes one or more people don't want to. They give up. They quit instead of loving. What about marriage problems? 50% of marriages in our country, and I don't know the worldwide statistic, end in divorce. I'm from a divorced background, okay? I can speak to that from experience in my own family. A lot of times, most of the time, maybe all the time, it's because one or both people are no longer like they should. But if we treated people right, when you love somebody, you don't mistreat them. When you love somebody, you don't give up on them. When you love somebody, you don't abuse them. When you love somebody, you don't neglect them. When you love somebody, you don't cheat on them. I understand all of that. But if we come to the situation with love and a desire to repair the relationship, we can fix it. What about problems in our communities or friendships? Right now our communities are torn apart. You have so much people butting heads. It's an election year, right? Where conservatives and liberals, Democrats, Republicans, people with all these different viewpoints constantly fighting, constantly butting heads, constantly not getting along. If we could just love each other the way the early church was expected, we can unite. Again, if the persecuted and the persecutors could get together and get along, we can too. Political differences can be overcome with love. All relationships can be repaired if we approach them with godly love. So how? What are some practical ways? How does this plan out? Number one, trust that God can make clean. The early Christians needed to trust when they found out about the conversion of Saul that he was made clean. Do we truly believe that God can save and change somebody? See, I've heard people say, they'll never change. Are you not believing the power of God? Are you doubting the power of the gospel? It changed Saul from the persecutor to the great preacher that we know as Paul today. We need to trust that God can make clean. And with that, then, we need to move past the past. Well, way back when, there was all these issues in our community, in our country, in our lives. We got to move past it. We got to move forward. We need to forgive those whom God has forgiven. You know, when Saul showed up to that first Christian assembly, the Christians there needed to forgive him. But he may have killed or been privy to the killing of some of their own family members and friends. You ever thought about that? We're not just talking about this is a figure that was doing stuff down in Jerusalem. No, he could have legitimately wreaked havoc on their own families. I don't know if I'm that godly of a person to let that go. But yet, they did. They were able to forgive him. We need to be willing to forgive those that God has forgiven. If someone has repented of sin, turned away from sin, ask God to forgive them, trust that God has. And we must forgive those whom God has forgiven. And then finally, we need to treat all with love. You know, sometimes there's division in churches. But if people would just forgive and treat each other with love, the division will be overcome. Political divisions can be overcome if we just forgive and love. Marriage problems, family problems, friendship problems, all of that. Jew and Gentile problems, right? They can be fixed if we treat one another with love. This world-changing movement, Christianity, founded on the gospel of Jesus Christ, requires unity, and the true basis of unity is love. And I think this is a message we need to hear today. Because think about this. You know, there's this term that's being floated around a lot right now, cancel culture, and I'm not going to get into all the political implications of that. But I think sometimes we have a tendency as individuals to just cancel people. We say, I'm done, no more. What if the early church canceled Saul? They didn't. They forgave him, loved, and accepted him. What if the early church, the Gentile Christians, canceled the Jews? No, they forgave, accepted, and loved. We cannot be an individual. We cannot be people. We cannot be a church that just writes everybody off in every relationship. But instead, we need to trust in love. We need to trust in God's grace. We need to trust in his forgiveness. We need to trust in the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ. If it can change Saul to Paul, it can change anyone else out there. And I think if we lean upon love and we approach every broken relationship with love, we will be surprised what love can repair. Think about what it did to the church in the first century. How love was able to repair some divisions that tore apart families, that were multi-generational, national, racial. They were able to repair all of that with love. You will be surprised what relationship love can repair. The lesson is yours this morning. We're going to sing another song here in a moment. Let me encourage you, though, that through the songs today, through the message that we've studied, that all of us are motivated to love the way that God would have us to love, to treat people that God would have us to treat them, and to trust in his grace, mercy, and forgiveness. The lesson is yours. We're going to have a song right now. Why don't we stand together and let's sing.